Being an adult man who's overly into Joe Rogan is a lot like being an adult man who's overly into wrestling. You're an inch away in either or from being inside other adult men. Not that there's anything wrong with that, of course, as long as you're open and honest about it. But dudes who are overly into masculine things tend to be the furthest away from actually being honest and open about it. You know exactly what I mean, the type of dude who's gonna scoff at you when you say something like, oh, I've taken up baking as a hobby. Or as I like to refer to them, spiritually gay men. Meaning they are sexually attracted to women, but they're so obsessed with being perceived as masculine that the idea of being perceived as feminine in any way terrifies them, meaning they'll only enjoy male hobbies, only accompany and talk to men, kiss other men, but they'll have straight sex with straight women. Hoorah! Boys! My weird tangent aside, you're not here for my weird deconstruction of what makes a man. You're here because you saw Joe Rogan being in the title. And in the spirit of my father, who promised me when he left me at the orphanage he never loved me and he never wanted to see me again, I too will keep my word. And for your viewing pleasure, I'll break down the news story of the recent Joe Rogan guest, a Mr. Sheldon Johnson, and his murder of a one Colin Smalls and the dismemberment of his body. Now for the record, when I first heard about this news story, I was genuinely a little bit shook. I believe this came out 6 days ago, and I just listened to this episode with this guy 2 weeks ago. But Dino, you just made fun of guys who listen to Joe Rogan. No, I made fun of guys who listen to Joe Rogan religiously. I'm a huge believer in the principle of the news bukake, meaning I don't believe in listening to one side of any news article and or political opinion and or person. So I'll occasionally pop on a Joe Rogan episode, just like I'll occasionally pop on a Hassan Piker clip. I prefer to have a mixed cream on my face from every single corner and every single side, and lick it all up and make up my own opinion. And admittedly, I do listen to quite a fair amount of Joe Rogan, purely because he has some of the best guests imaginable. There's a damn good reason he's the #1 podcast in the world, whether you like him or not. I mean, for Christ's sakes, the Riley Gaines episode, and yes, I am fully meat riding at this point, I'm gaping, was probably one of, if not the best interviews ever done, where Joe Rogan invited on professional swimmer Riley Gaines, or formerly so, a quote-unquote woman's activist who was directly affected from the whole trans athlete debate. It was absolutely fascinating to hear her side of events, and I cannot recommend it enough. Now, I'm not asking you to agree with everything she says, but I am asking you, if you do listen to it, please listen with an open mind, and try to think of it from a perspective of a trained athlete who's worked hard her whole life. And I know you're starting to feel like you're wasting your life listening to me yap on, so let's get on with it. Sheldon Johnson, the alleged murderer and mutilator of Colin Small's corpse, is a former Bloods gang member and is currently a prison reforms activist. Sheldon spent a huge majority of his life in prison, being sentenced all the way back in 1998. He was sentenced for 2 different charges and was facing a maximum sentence of 50 years in total. The first sentence, as he put it, was a result of a drug deal quote-unquote gone bad. According to Sheldon, whilst he was in lockup for another charge that he later beat, I know it's very confusing, but you gotta remember the man was a professional gangster. He pretty much lived his entire life in and out of jail cells before his big boy sentence. He had set up a consignment drug deal. What that means is Sheldon provided the product to a third-party seller in order for this person to sell the drugs on. As Sheldon puts it, the drugs were sold, but he never received payment. His logic behind it was he thought that the man who didn't pay him assumed that he would go down for prison for that sentence that he later beat, and as such decided not to pay him. Mr. Johnson later ran into that man on the street with his girlfriend. Now I might have to bust out some of my street lingo for you, but that fella were iced out, and so were her bitch, which from Johnson's perspective would have been quite insulting considering that he was owed $5,000 for the drugs that he sold to this man. Sheldon, out of frustration and of course because he was being a gangster and you can't disrespect no one like that, homie, we're either gonna break dance or we're gonna kiss this out in my head. But he opted for the third option, which was violence, as the man refused to pay him the $5,000 right then and made excuses.
Where's my money at? Oh, yo, I was gonna pay you. As far as I was concerned, his jury was... we was even.
Sheldon and his gang members then beat and robbed both the man and his girlfriend and went along on their merry way. The second charge comes from a similar experience, where Sheldon was owed money by a Mexican man, and in his words, he quote-unquote roughed him up, but didn't assault him.
Another guy that I ran into, he also owed me some money. He owed me $7,000, and it kind of went along the same ways. He was selling drugs out of an auto parts store.
According to Sheldon, he was arrested in December of 1997 and charged with both of these crimes. Long story short, Sheldon was basically made an example of and was given the max sentence for both crimes consecutively. It's also worth stating, before you get all up in a tizzy, that the judge that sentenced him was black, as well as the person who was defending him was black, with the prosecutor being the only white man. So I don't believe race played a role in his harsh punishment. I think personally the judge was slapped with this opportunity to take take a well-known gang member off the street and decided to give him the harshest possible punishment. At some point during his sentence, Johnson decided to change his life around.
And I remember when he said 50 years. He said he went into all of these reasons why he was sentencing me the way that he was sentencing me. And on the time computation sheet, it gives you all of the numbers, like the beginning of your bid, how much jail time you have. And I just remember 2049. That's all I kept looking at. And I'm trying to do the math, and I'm just like, 2049? I'm like, that's 50 years from now. And something just says, look up life expectancy. And I look up my life expectancy. And as an African-American man, my life expectancy at that time was 67 years old. And I did the math. And I said, I'm going to die in prison, man.
Even going so far that in the year 2005, according to Sheldon, he left the gang organization of the Bloods entirely. Truth be told, I'm a little bit iffy on believing him about that, purely because he also later said that there were absolutely zero repercussions for him leaving the gang, in spite of being on top of the food chain. I'm not too sure how familiar you are with gang cultures and being in prison, but as someone who's been turned out more than once, I'm extremely familiar with gangster pillow talk, meaning it's extremely unlikely for somebody to break away from a gang with absolutely zero repercussions and or consequences, and to not only break away but then also thrive. Sheldon then completed his high school diploma, as well as joined various prison reform courses. Also, I'm not being funny or anything, guys. Being an actively proud and well-known gang member, as he claimed to be, and especially as also he claimed to be that he was the top dog of the prison, at least in his individual gang set, that doesn't look very good on paper, especially when you're trying to get released from jail in front of a parole board. A parole board that saw him as a model prisoner and one who genuinely wanted to change his life and ways. Spoiler alert, he didn't end up spending the entire 50 years of his consecutive sentences, but was rather released in May of 2023. Give or take 9 months later, after working with the organization Queen's Defenders, a law firm that specializes in the representation of people who can't afford their own lawyers, he had his meeting with fate and was brought on to Joe Rogan alongside with his lawyer, who was the man responsible with getting him free after 25 years, and Mr. Josh Dubin, in order to discuss Mr. Sheldon Johnson's life experiences, the ways he ended up down that road, and why he believes it's important to represent people with more than just state-appointed lawyers. Holy shit, let me catch my breath, that was an absolute mouthful. All of that yapping and backstory has led us to today, where Mr. Sheldon was caught, and you have to say allegedly, even though in this humble YouTuber's opinion, his hand is as red as my arse was in that prison, in this murder/decapitation plot, or I suppose the word dismemberment's a bit more accurate. The details of the exact sticky icky are a little bit muddy to say the least. We're not 110% sure why, but we do know for a fact that the two men knew each other from prison. So it has been speculated that there was a dispute from that time, and has carried over into civilian life. What we do know, allegedly for sure, is that Colin was murdered in his apartment, as one of the neighbors reportedly heard him pleading for his life, followed by 2 gunshots. The exact words that the neighbor said Mr. Colin uttered was, "Please don't do this, I have a wife and kids." It was then caught on surveillance footage, Mr. Johnson leaving Mr. Small's home and re-entering with cleaning supplies. Over the course of a few hours, multiple trash bags were seen leaving the apartment with Mr. Johnson, and yet with no sign of Mr. Small. When the police eventually did turn up, they found a man's torso and foot inside of Mr. Small's apartment, and after clocking the fact that it was Sheldon Johnson on the footage, they then raided his apartment and found Mr. Colin Small's fucking head, as well as his legs and arms. Sheldon, for his part, has blatantly said he is innocent and he did not do what the police accused him of, and has since been arrested.
Sheldon Johnson being walked off in handcuffs, yelling to reporters that he didn't do what cops say he did.
I would like to inform you, because I don't think I made it clear, Sheldon is 48 years old, meaning he was sent to prison at the age of 23 and has only been out for nearly a year, give or take. He is now going back to prison for alleged murder, which doesn't seem very f***ing alleged to me when the oak has the dude's head in his freezer in his f***ing apartment. This is why I've always said I'm of the belief if you're gonna be a criminal, please don't be a stupid criminal, which Sheldon very much is. Not only did he spend literally the majority of his life in prison, meaning he had access to other prisoners who also committed crime, aka giving him an education in crime and ways to get away with it, but he also worked for an organization that represented criminals. And then that same fella, who then later committed a murder, didn't apply any of that vast resource of knowledge that he had to not get himself caught. He's a bad guy who clearly killed this guy, but he didn't even try to cover his tracks. They have his face on CCTV. They have have the victim's body parts in his house. It's a slam dunk. Sheldon could not be more guilty. Honestly, they have him such dead to f***ing rights that he may as well have worn Mr. Small's skin and walked around pretending to be him. Just like how you need to pretend to be an educated man by legally subscribing to Dino. As always, guys, that's all I have to say on the matter, and I'll keep you updated when I hear more. Bye bye.